Welcome to our introductory course on Eternalism, the divine philosophy of the eternal worlds. Unit 21, The Primacy of Existence, Part 3. In Unit 21, we'll follow two paths for the origin of rights, from metaphysics to politics. The primacy of existence leads to liberty and rights grounded in human nature, while the primacy of consciousness leads to tyranny and rights dictated by God, the state, or the collective will. We'll also show why American pluralism only works if rights are rooted in reality, not divine decree. In the end, it's simple. Stand with reality and the primacy of existence, or succumb to tyranny and the primacy of consciousness. We have argued that both the gospel of Jesus Christ and the philosophy of eternalism uphold the primacy of existence, where existence holds Tier 1 status over consciousness, making the primacy of existence the only true winning proposition. In contrast, we have fully rejected the primacy of consciousness, which falsely gives consciousness Tier 1 status over existence, allowing the subjective ideals and whims of others to rule over us, a consistently losing proposition. Any attempt to argue otherwise is self-defeating, since consciousness itself depends on existence to even make the argument. In this battle for Tier 1 primacy, the verdict is clear. Checkmate, game over. This is where force enters the equation. And yet, we also saw that the primacy of consciousness mentality quickly realized. We don't have to control reality, we just have to control you. On its own, this threat is limited, but when backed by state power and enforced compliance, it becomes full-blown tyranny. This is where the principle of rights comes into play, along with the foundational Republican ideal that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights, by protecting individuals from such unlawful force. Rights exist to secure liberty by requiring governments to defend against primitive, criminal, and tyrannical violence, using legitimate retaliatory force to protect, not violate, the inherent rights of all. This upholds the crucial principle that right makes might. Today, however, this principle is under siege as the threat shifts from local to global tyranny, where might makes right combines the brutality of predatory force with the unchecked power of tyranny itself. Some might be surprised to see rights come up so early in our introduction to eternalism, but this is intentional. It underscores the core claim that the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness is the foundational gospel primacy issue from which nearly every philosophical, religious, and political error flows. Here we see its centrality again, directly tied to force and rights. The primacy of existence upholds individual rights, and the principle of right makes might, while the primacy of consciousness empowers collective force, and the opposite principle of might makes right. This foundational clash shapes not only our theology, but also our daily lives as Latter-day Saints and Americans, especially in today's divided and politicized world. At the root of all this conflict lies the battle between these two opposing mentalities. For instance, here are three critical questions that apply to our understanding of rights and which need to be addressed first and foremost within this primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness context. That is, what is the original source of rights? What is the individual nature of rights? And what is the contextual nature of rights? The point is this: there are two possible paths or routes for addressing these three fundamental questions about rights. How we answer them depends entirely on whether we follow the primacy of existence path or route to liberty, or the primacy of consciousness path or route to tyranny. That choice determines everything that follows, including whether we end up with liberty or tyranny. This is where our philosophical stickman, illustrating the hierarchy of the 5 branches of philosophy, helps us visualize the two distinct routes. Each begins with the metaphysical source of rights and works its way up to politics, where those rights are either secured or violated. We started with the foundational question of primacy, existence, or consciousness, a metaphysical issue at the base of philosophy. Yet we've now arrived at politics, a much higher branch of philosophy. How did we get here? And more importantly, which path brought us here, the primacy of existence, or the primacy of consciousness? To illustrate, we'll first highlight the primacy of consciousness route with its ultimate appeal to force, one our own founding fathers partially followed. Drawing from their Christian heritage, they appealed to a creator God as the source of rights in the Declaration of Independence, declaring that man was endowed by God with individual and inalienable rights, and that governments existed to secure those rights. This leap from metaphysics, a creator God, to politics, individual rights, brilliantly bypassed the divine right of kings, but at a cost. It still rested on the primacy of consciousness, appealing to the will of an unaccountable heavenly king to offset the will of an arbitrary earthly king. This worked in the short run, but in the long run, it left the door open for rights to be treated as grants of divine or state authority, rather than objective facts rooted in human nature and reality itself. Think of it this way. If God is the source of rights, the next question is, which God? The Christian God, the Muslim God, or the impersonal cosmic force of Eastern religions? Appealing to God solves nothing. It just shifts the fight to whose God gets to decide what rights exist. And once again, this kind of unresolved dispute, rooted in the primacy of consciousness, can only end one way, with an appeal to force. This leads to another fatal flaw. If governments exist to secure rights that come from God, how can church and state ever truly be separate? They can't. The state would be enforcing the rights of a specific God, tied to a specific church or religion. Just look at Iran, where the Muslim God, Islamic law, and the state are one, hardly a model of religious tolerance or political liberty. Some claim American pluralism solves this problem with its appeal to tolerance and religious freedom. But does it really? Hold that thought. We'll come back to it soon. Now let's transition from the creator God in the primacy of consciousness route to tyranny, to the primacy of existence route to liberty, and the concept of rights. By mapping the path from metaphysics to politics once again, we begin once more with the foundational question which has primacy, existence or consciousness. But instead of appealing to a creator God as the source of rights, we appeal to human nature. This is why the founding fathers wisely and strategically invoked the laws of nature and nature's God, a subtle but critical shift from authority-imposed rights to reality-based rights. This primacy of existence path must pass through value ethics, where man's mortal life becomes the standard of value. Because human life is both conditional and volitional, its survival depends on two factors, internal and external conditions. These internal conditions involve cultivating right habits, virtues that sustain life, versus vices that threaten it. Along with these internal conditions, or right habits, are the equally necessary external conditions. These external conditions involve obtaining and maintaining right habitats, the physical and social environments necessary for life to thrive, including physical and intellectual property, as well as individual rights to protect that property. From the necessity of obtaining and sustaining these external conditions, the principle of individual rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness naturally follows, rights that governments are instituted to secure. We have thus arrived at politics, completing the bridge from metaphysics, where reality and human nature establish the foundation for rights, to politics, where those rights are secured. This is the primacy of existence route to liberty, where rights come not from God's will, but from human nature itself. This is also why American pluralism works, because it's grounded in reality, the primacy of existence, not divine decree, which would make them dependent on the will of this or that creator God, and inevitably descending into religious tyranny. We'll explore the primacy of existence and its connection to individual rights in more depth in Unit 22. But before we close, let's take a final look at American pluralism. For most Christians and Americans, This pluralism is understood as the freedom to believe, worship, and live as you choose, so long as you don't violate the God-given rights of others. This understanding of American pluralism, that rights are God-given, may have worked in the short run, but it cannot sustain our rights in the long run. It's important to understand why. So let's turn to that now and ask the critical question, does it really work? The answer, as we'll shortly see, is both yes and no. Yes, if rights are grounded in reality and human nature, the primacy of existence, which is a winning proposition because it leads to liberty and true religious freedom, where man holds primacy over the state, and inalienable rights hold primacy over government power, upholding the principle that right makes might. And no, American pluralism doesn't work if God is seen as the source of rights, grounded in the primacy of consciousness mentality, which we have shown to be a losing proposition that leads to tyranny and religious persecution, where the state holds primacy over man and dictates which rights you have, enforcing the principle that might makes right. Whether American pluralism can succeed in both the short run and the long run depends entirely on its foundation. Does it rest on reality and human nature, or on the arbitrary will of God? This is why it's crucial to understand that the true origin of rights is rooted in human nature, not in divine decree, no matter how comforting or devout that belief may seem. To conclude, let's emphasize this once more. There are only two paths for answering the three fundamental questions about rights: their source, their individual nature, and their proper context. The path we choose, the primacy of existence or the primacy of consciousness, determines everything that follows, including whether we secure liberty or succumb to tyranny. In the end, it's a simple choice: stand with reality or yield to the tyranny of the primacy of consciousness and force. This concludes our Unit 21 presentation. Thank you for watching. Join us for Unit 22, where we'll continue exploring the primacy of existence versus primacy of consciousness, along with the origins, nature, and context of individual rights. Don't forget to watch the Unit 21 overview quiz, and just as important, revisit the Unit 19 overview quiz, where we walked through the possible origins of rights, God, the state, society, or human nature.